Today we're going to talk about the arrows. As well we know, arrow shafts are made by different materials.
So one of the materials is wood. Now wood was traditionally used in northern China just because that's what the climate allowed for. And you would use things like willow, birch, and poplar. These days you can get access to cedar and spruce as well on other continents. And the density, the hardness of the wood would correspond with whether you were using a heavier bow or a lighter bow. Now usually you could use a self-nock, a knock that's cut out of the wood itself. These days you can also put maybe a plastic knock at the end of the arrow, or if you still wanted something that was strong, but traditionally you would use either a horn insert or make a knock out of the horn itself. In this case, this is actually a crested arrow. This is a Turkish arrow made by a friend, Ramazan Simsek. So this was given to me as a gift. So wood, again, is one material that you could use for arrows. Another material you could use is bamboo. This is a material that you would traditionally use in hotter, more humid climates, like southern China, for example. And the quality of the shaft, you can find cheaper, more affordable, usable shafts. They're usually machined and smoothed out. Sometimes you can find shafts that are reinforced with slices of laminated bamboo, like in this case right here. Or if you wanted to go kind of the most traditional route, then you would find bamboo that is just one solid piece with all the nodes intact. So in this case, you can see here that this is the node of the bamboo, this is the node of the bamboo, and literally this is just growing out of the ground, and you would pick it and you would hand straighten it, heat it, straighten it, and craft a sort of a nice work of art out of it. This particular arrow is made by a friend of ours, Jaap Kopendreyer, and it has a horn knock at the end. But you can have bamboo arrows with self knocks as well. So this was another traditional material that was popular to use. Now, if you're in the market for artificial material shafts for your arrows, there are two main types of materials available. There's aluminum, and then there is carbon. Now sometimes the carbon might be coated with an extra layer of printed paper or some other material, and this is actually a carbon arrow, but it has a wood print on it. This is a gold tip traditional, pretty popular with traditional archers, and there are similar brands as well. So in addition to aluminum and carbon, there's also composite aluminum carbon arrows as well.
That's right. So this is a Eastern ACC. It's carbon oxide and aluminum as a core. And the reason I got it is because at the beginning, and I was so afraid of carbon exploding in my hand. So I think one extra aluminum core might prevent it. But the fact is, it's not that helpful. And the aluminum core inside actually made this arrow shaft so easy to bend. It's not that good.
Yeah, and the thing is, with modern carbon arrows, they're woven in such a way that when they break, it's going to break in a safer manner. The old style carbon arrows, when they split, they would kind of splinter out like this in long spines, and that was pretty dangerous. So modern manufacturers, they typically have a spiral weave or a combination of like a straight and a spiral weave, so that if the carbon arrow breaks, then it's gonna, it's not going to be dramatic and super unsafe.
That's right. And as long as you do the inspections before shooting, I think carbon arrows will be 100% safe. And
yeah, there's another type of composite arrow which is aluminum on the outside and carbon on the inside, like this Easton Full Metal Jacket Dangerous Game arrow. And I don't see any particular advantage of it other than it's just really, really heavy, because I need this for my 100+ pound bows.
that's right.
Now, regardless of the shaft material that you're using for your arrow, you want to inspect your arrows for safety.
Yes, especially for carbon. And if you hear something hard, or just in general before going to the range, you should inspect your arrows. First of all, just good lighting is very important. Just touch it and all the way rotate it and just see if there is any crack on it. If you find no crack or nothing on it. Just like, find a quiet place and bend it slightly. Not like, bend heavily, just bend it slightly, like just check if you can hear anything. And if you can't hear anything, and it's good to go.
As far as safety checks on natural arrows, you do want to check for cracks. You do want to check the straightness, but don't do that flex test like what you would do with carbon arrows. The natural materials are not meant to be tested like that. Now, natural materials could have a bend in them. That's why you check for straightness. And actually, aluminum arrows, they can have that as well, so check for that. Another critical aspect of arrow safety is making sure the arrow is the correct length. If your arrow is too short, you're going to overdraw the arrow beyond the bow handle and bad things will happen. So you want to make sure your arrow is the correct length. Now, for our style of archery, we do have a rule of thumb that you can use to estimate your initial draw length. What you want to do is you want to stand with one arm outstretched to the side like this, and you're going to have a friend measure from the center of your spine to the tip of your middle finger, like so.
This is 33 1/4 for Justin.
Okay, so that number for me, my arm span, is 33 1/4. I'll multiply that by 1.3 and I'll subtract 15. That number ends up being about 28 1/4 from the back of the handle of the bow. Now, that is what this arrow measures from the valley of the nock almost to the back of the point. Although I add, about ½ an inch from 28 1/4 so that I have a little bit of a margin when I get to full draw, because I like to touch the back of the arrowhead with the tip of my thumb, like so. So I have a little bit of margin there. Of course, how much of a margin you give yourself, that's going to be customized. That's going to be sort of totally up to what your preference is for your bow hand anchor or your draw length indicator. We'll have more notes about this in the description of the video, about how to choose the ideal draw length for you. Now, when you have a properly sized arrow, it's good to have a draw length indicator on it, because with a draw length indicator, you can prevent overdrawing. That is, drawing the arrow tip past the handle. That's not a safe situation. And also, having a draw length indicator helps prevent underdrawing, right? If you don't have a draw length indicator, you might think you're at full draw, but you're actually underdrawing, and maybe a week later your full draw looks like this because you don't have a sense of where your full draw is. So definitely it's good to have a draw length indicator for your arrow. Now, if you're in rapid shooting applications such as horse archery or speed shooting on foot, then you'll actually probably want to have a little bit of an extra safety margin on your arrow. An arrow that's a little longer, where you're not necessarily touching the draw length indicator, but because you're shooting rapidly, drawing rapidly, that little extra margin will help prevent an overdraw.
Besides length, arrow mass is another critical part to pay attention to. And so basically you don't want to shoot like a arrow that's too light. It might damage your bow. And you don't want to shoot like, arrows that's too heavy, neither. It might slow the arrow speed down.
Yeah, and also you want the mass of your arrows to be consistent as well, because if your quiver of arrows contains light arrows and heavy arrows, then they're going to fly at different speeds and you're not going to get a consistent group. On that note, this is an important tool to have, which is an arrow scale. So we want to choose an arrow to use with this bow here. This bow weighs about 54 pounds at my draw length. And let's measure this one here. So that weighs about 350 grains. If we were to compute a ratio, it would be about 6.6 grains of arrow mass per pound of bow draw weight. So that's way too light. That's below the manufacturer's warranty for minimum arrow mass ratio. Now here's another arrow. and that weighs 467. So that brings us to about 8.7, 8.8 grains per pound of bow draw weight, and that's appropriate, and that's within the warranty for this particular manufacturer here. Now, the ideal arrow weight for the bow, it's going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. Some do better with 9 grains per pound, some with 10 grains per pound. Others, like the bigger Manchu bows, 15 grains per pound. But definitely ask the bow maker for what's the minimum recommended arrow mass and the recommended arrow mass. And when you're in doubt, please, please, please measure. This type of scale is not that expensive. Don't just guess. There are different ways to adjust the mass of the arrow itself. Now remember, the total mass is the sum of the mass of all the components. That includes not just the shaft, but also the feathers, the nock, the insert, and the point, right? And points come in a variety of weights, from light to heavy. From as light as 55 grains, sometimes lighter, to as much as 200 grains. I've seen 350 grain points too. So a lot of choices available there if you're using artificial arrows. With natural arrows, there's less flexibility in adjusting the mass. Once they're made, they're pretty much the mass that they're going to be. Maybe you could unglue the point and put a heavier one in, but pretty much what you get initially is what you'll get. So think carefully before you invest in a set of natural arrows. Now the final thing you want to take into consideration is how the arrow flies after it's left the bow, or for tuning your arrow to your bow. Now the reality is that the arrow is actually going to kind of slightly bend around the handle. It's also going to vibrate, oscillate on its way out of the bow. Now the degree of oscillation, how much it initially deflects around the handle, that's governed by a few different factors. So the first factor is the spine of the shaft.
Yeah, spine is just a number, and it tells you how much the arrow shaft flex. And for the modern materials, you can always find the spine chart on the manufacturer's website, so you can get a rough idea what kind of spine you want to get. But for the natural materials, it's better to measure yourself, and if you can't do it, just go to the pro shop and let them to do it for you.
Yeah. So with the spine on artificial arrows, they're typically measured in inches of deflection. What they'll do is they'll set up a scale which supports the arrow on shaft on both ends for a standard distance, and they'll put a weight on there, and how much it bends is the deflection. So a higher number means a more flexible shaft, a lower number means a stiffer shaft. And typically well, it depends on your release. Typically for thumb draw archers, we'll need slightly stiffer spines compared to finger shooters. But this is going to vary person to person. It's going to depend on the nature of your release. The second factor to keep in mind is the length of the arrow. So manufacturers measure the flexibility of the spine of the arrow at a standard length. If your actual arrow is longer than that, then it's going to be softer for a given spine. If your actual arrow is shorter than that standard measurement length, then it's going to be stiffer for a given spine. So you want to take that into account. Like for example, if you have a long draw length, you're probably going to have to order a stiffer spine in order to have an arrow that matches well with your bow. Now the third factor to consider is the distribution of mass on the arrow itself. Whether you have more or less mass at the front of the arrow, more or less mass at the tail, or the density of the shaft itself, whether it's more dense or less dense. So as far as their effect on the initial deflection of the arrow, if you have a heavier point, then what will happen is that the arrow will flex a little bit more initially. It'll bend around the handle a bit more. If you have less mass at the tip, like if you make it lighter, then it's not going to flex as much initially. It may fly off to the side a bit more. So you want to find a good middle point in terms of the front mass. Now with the tail, if you have a heavier tail, then it's not going to deflect as much. It's going to fly. The arrow's going to fly a bit stiffer. If you have less mass at the tail, the arrow's going to fly a bit more flexibly. So that's something to consider as well. And on top of that, whether the vibration is timed so that the tail can clear the bow handle is a function of the distribution of mass as well. So if you have more mass at the tail or the head, then the arrow is going to vibrate slower. If you have more mass, if you have a denser shaft, the arrow is going to vibrate slower as well. Likewise, if you have less mass at the head and the tail, the arrow is going to vibrate faster. If you have less density in the shaft, the arrow is going to vibrate faster as well. And whether it vibrates faster or slower, and whether that matches well with your bow, is going to really depend. You're going to have to try that out.
Yeah, no matter, I mean, science and calculations are good, but nothing beats just going to the range and try it out yourself.
Yeah.
Now you have your arrows ready. Next step would be having a decent quiver to carry them. So this is a nice, decent, close quiver, and it was pretty popular in Tang Dynasty. And the benefit of having them is just it can carry so many arrows. And see the size. And the way you carry arrow is make sure the arrow point forwards like this. So when you want to grab it on foot or on horseback, just grab this part of the arrow and just take it out and hook it.
The other popular style of quiver, especially in later centuries, is the open quiver, where the tips are facing down and forward, the tails are facing up and back. And when you want to retrieve an arrow for shooting, you'll grab it mid-shaft, like so, and then get the arrow ready. Now, this style is pretty blinged up. It's pretty fancy, you know, it has these metal pieces, and you would actually see this level of decoration on antique quivers. But of course, you know, on the market today, you can find more basic ones that'll fit your budget. But please bear in mind that quivers at the hip were traditional. Back quivers, not traditional for Asiatic archery.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's more of like a modern fantasy. But you know, for historical purposes, quivers at the hip were the way to go. Well, we hope you enjoyed today's video and found it useful. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
See you.